we see that Haman himself struggles with an even more powerful enemy, and that is his own pride. And as we study these chapters, we see what happens to people who let pride reign. Hello and welcome to the Advocate podcast with me, Dr. Amy Orr-Ewing. We are dedicated to public advocacy for the Christian faith, sometimes referenced as apologetics or public theology. We're also passionate about equipping leaders and supporting Christians to respond to life's toughest questions with wisdom, compassion, and truth. In today's episode, we're diving back into the Word and back into the Book of Esther, and we're going to hear some live teaching on it, interspersed with reflections on that live teaching. Again, if you're listening last time, the context was a series of messages delivered at the Edinburgh Convention Centre on the Book of Esther. And again, the context is that in our cultural moment, which is fascinated with power, who has power, how is power handled or abused, this particular biblical text, the Book of Esther, is unbelievably relevant. We're introduced to a man who is really dangerous, partly because he's puffed up by pride, but massively because he is attracted to power. Interestingly, a little while ago, I was listening to the thinker Jordan Peterson being interviewed on a podcast by someone called Tim Stanley. And he said this, he said, "The Bible is the library of stories on which the most productive, freest and most stable and peaceful societies the world has ever known are predicated. The foundation of the West, plain and simple. Part of the reason we have a culture war is because the postmodernists discovered that the structure through which we see reality is a story. But they leapt to the conclusion that the story is by necessity one of power. That's wrong. It's not only wrong, it borders on psychopathic." He says, "Organizing your world by means of power is not productive. It turns out that the optimal strategy for moving forward is sacrificial." What does that mean? The community is founded on sacrifice. Why? Because you have to give something up to be with someone else. You have to give up the primacy of your whims. He says the biblical stories are in large part an investigation into the structure of sacrifice. I think Jordan Peterson is saying something really interesting there in that conversation with Tim Stanley. And he develops it in his book, We Who Wrestle with God, a bit further. So let's dive into the text, which is really thinking about these questions of power. And let's listen for a few moments about these thoughts on the Book of Esther. So now we pick the story up in chapter 3, and the heading of what we're going to be looking at this morning together is about resisting enemies, resisting evil. Okay, so chapter 3, verses 1 to 6. After these events, King Xerxes honoured Haman, son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, elevating him and giving him a seat of honour higher than that of all the other nobles. All the royal officials at the king's gate knelt down and paid honour to Haman, for the king had commanded this concerning him, but Mordecai would not kneel down or pay honour. Then the royal officials at the king's gate asked Mordecai, "Why do you disobey the king's command?" Day after day they spoke to him, but he refused to comply. And therefore they told Haman about it to see whether Mordecai's behaviour would be tolerated, for he had told them that he was a Jew. And when Haman saw that Mordecai would not kneel down or pay him honour, he was enraged. Yet, having learned who Mordecai's people were, he scorned the idea of killing only Mordecai. Instead, Haman looked for a way to destroy all of Mordecai's people, the Jews, throughout the whole kingdom of Xerxes. So remember, the kingdom was the whole known world, from India to Ethiopia. So it's not enough to kill one person. We need to kill everyone associated with this one person in the known world. Okay, so this morning we're going to be thinking about this. How do we resist a powerful enemy? And Haman is a powerful enemy to have made. But before we think about him and resisting him specifically, we see that Haman himself struggles with an even more powerful enemy, and that is his own pride. And as we study these chapters, we see what happens to people who let pride reign. Now, as the chapters go on, and we'll look a little bit at this tonight, we see that Esther seemed to understand this when she invited Haman alongside the king to her various feasts that she was going to hold. She knew that he would love that proximity to royalty. But we see a few features of Haman's pride and what it means to have pride as an enemy. What does pride really look like? Well, Haman had the highest position in the administration of the most powerful empire on earth. And this was a hierarchical shame and honor culture. And in that culture, bowing was instinctive. You just bow to someone older than you. You bow to someone socially superior to you or higher than you in the pecking order. But Haman was a person who, even in that society, which just instinctively would have had people bowing, he was a person who needed the king to command people to bow to him. He needed the king to make people bow to him. And in that context, Mordecai refused. He refused to do it. He refused to give respect where he felt it wasn't due. And that seriously annoyed Haman. Flick over to chapter 5 and verse 11 to get an insight into just how preening Haman's pride was. Calling together his friends and Zeresh, his wife, Haman boasted to them about his vast wealth, his many sons, and all the ways the king had honored him, and how he had elevated him above the other nobles and officials. And that's not all, Haman added. I'm the only person Queen Esther invited to accompany the king to the banquet she gave, and she has invited me along with the king tomorrow. But, verse 13, all this gives me no satisfaction as long as I see that Jew, Mordecai, sitting at the king's gate. None of all of that success that he boasts about can give me any satisfaction while I see this Jew sitting. What an extraordinary portrait of a preening, insecure, but proud person. What is pride? C.S. Lewis says, pride is ruthless, sleepless, unsmiling concentration on the self. Pride makes you concentrate on you. Nothing can be about the people around you or a cause greater than you that you are serving. There cannot be any focus even on what you are doing because everything is about you. And insofar as anyone else features at all, pride is only interested in a comparative and in a competitive assessment. So other people only feature in comparison to you. C.S. Lewis puts it like this. He says, pride gets no pleasure out of having something, only out of having more of it than the next person. It is the comparison that makes you proud, the pleasure of being above the rest. And once the element of competition is gone, pride is gone. It's not enough that I can be doing well. I need to be doing better than the people around me. Pride turns everything into a means to an end, and the end is getting approval. The end is feeling superior. Pride is about endless ego calculation, adding things up. Am I getting what I really deserve? How am I regarded? How is everything going for me? And in this text, we see a kind of superiority pride. Haman suffers from this. But its mirror and equal formulation is an inferiority complex. Pride that is around being inferior means that you are constantly down on yourself, constantly and continually self-conscious, forever verbally and mentally beating yourself up. The self-absorption is the same. The self is totally and utterly central. Tim Keller writes this. The thing we would remember from meeting a truly gospel humble person is how much they seem to be totally interested in us. Because the essence of gospel humility is not thinking more of myself or thinking less of myself. It is thinking of myself less. Gospel humility is not needing to think about myself, not needing to connect things with myself. It's an end to thoughts such as, I'm in this room with these people. Does that make me look good? Do I want to be here? True gospel humility means I stop connecting every experience, every conversation with myself. In fact, I stop thinking about myself. There's a freedom in self-forgetfulness, the blessed rest that only self-forgetfulness brings. Humility is not thinking less of yourself, but thinking of yourself less. Not requiring or wanting or needing the approval of others. Not living in constant, continual, competitive comparison. A humble person is a happy person who's at peace. Haman is afflicted himself by an enemy, and that enemy is pride. What does pride lead to? What does it do? Pride causes Haman to want to go beyond killing Mordecai to now slaughtering all the Jews. There is a kind of rapaciousness to the power of this enemy, pride. Pride harms its host. It harms the person who is afflicted by pride. But it also has a ripple effect, affecting tsunamis of people around us, tsunamis of pain and grief, violence and destruction. In relationships, in communities, in families, it is utterly toxic, destroying people. In chapter 3, we see that this king, Xerxes, he allows Haman to go ahead with his plan to destroy the Jews, taking their wealth as plunder, and thousands of people are going to die. Pride leads to devastation and to destruction. There's a psychological and a sociological deadliness to it. And pride is the enemy of all God's people. Whether we battle with superiority or inferiority, Haman is here in Scripture as a warning. Don't let pride spoil your life or the lives of those around you. Now, of course, as Christians, whenever we read the Old Testament, we read it through the lens of Jesus. We read it through the lens of a New Testament reality that the writer of this book didn't know. They were looking forward to it, but we read back through the lens. And so we know that in Christ we have the opportunity to change, to be transformed. We can turn to him if we are on the receiving end, if we are have pride as our enemy, and it's actually pretty powerful in our lives and is now moving out from us towards others, we have the potential of Christ, the deliverer. One of the people that I have the privilege of working with is a man called Tom Tarrance, and he's an American. As a teenager, he got embroiled in extreme right-wing thinking, and he signed up and became a member of the White Knights of the Ku Klux Klan. By the time he was a young man, he'd been captured by the American authorities and imprisoned for terrorism. Now, he was a pretty fanatical person, and he was obsessed with the superiority of the white man. And that pride and that superiority drove his life. He was in prison, and he recruited some people in prison to help him escape, and he actually managed to escape. And that led to him being put on America's 10 Most Wanted when Edgar Hoover was head of the FBI. And a particular FBI agent was given the job of tracking down Tom Tarrant, of recapturing him and putting him back in prison. And this particular man, this FBI agent, was married to a Christian. And this lady, this wife, was in a women's Bible study. And she was very, very concerned about the salvation of her husband. And she and her friends were regularly praying that her husband, this FBI agent, would become a Christian. And he was obsessed. He was working hard. He needed to capture one of America's 10 most wanted. Eventually, there was a shootout. They tracked him down. They found him. And they recaptured him, and Tom was put into a maximum security prison in America, and he was put in solitary confinement. And he was allowed to ask for books to be sent to his cell so that he could read them. And the first book he asked for was Mein Kampf by Hitler, and he read that. And then he read other right-wing toxic literature. And then, for some reason, he asked that a New Testament be sent to his cell. And as he read the New Testament, he met the Lord Jesus. And the toxic hate and pride in his heart completely disappeared. He was utterly transformed. He started a prayer meeting in the prison with the head of the Black Panthers, and together they led a Christian prayer meeting. Now, he's a pretty well-known guy, so news of this story got back out, and it actually got back to Edgar Hoover, and Edgar Hoover was concerned. He thought, this is probably a jailhouse conversion. This guy's probably trying to manipulate his sentence and get out. He's pretending to have had a religious, experience. So he sent the FBI agent who'd originally been tasked with tracking Tom, to finding him, capturing him, and interrogating him and imprisoning him. So this FBI agent knew Tom really well. And when he walked into that prison cell, he knew the person sitting across the table from him was a different person. Jesus had so transformed him that even his countenance, even his face looked different. The FBI agent went in skeptical, but he walked out of that cell convinced of the reality of a God who could change the heart and change the life and change the mind of a toxic, superior, right-wing, racist terrorist. And he became a Christian. His wife's Bible study were quite excited about that, as you can imagine. And later on, Tom and this FBI agent worked together in sort of civil rights and healing and stuff in America. It's the most amazing story. But Tom, is now an older man, and he is one of the most humble people I've ever met. He has an incredible testimony. I've just condensed it into, very, very short telling. Incredible testimony, access to people of all sorts of power. But he's been transformed by Jesus. Pride is no longer his enemy. Pride is no longer in his heart because God has got hold of him. So resisting that enemy of pride, Haman's enemy is pride. Second point I want to make this morning is resisting Haman himself as the enemy. Now, the threat and the intimidation that are coming from Haman are truly ominous in this text. The enemy, this enemy embodied, if you like, in Haman, wants to make God's people afraid, wants to destroy and discourage and bring an end to us. And here in the text, the enemy is Haman. But in Esther, it is clear that he represents the cosmic enemy of God's people. And so we're left with the question, how do we resist? How do we resist that cosmic enemy of God's people? And how does Esther and how do God's people here in this text resist him? You see, the reality is that we will all, as followers of Jesus, face and experience opposition, difficulty, trial, enemies. Some of it will be trivial, and some of it will be more serious. For 7 years, my husband and I lived in London, in one of London's most violent and gang-ridden neighbourhoods, and we led a church there that ministered powerfully to that community. And the Lord really worked in amazing ways in that church. It grew phenomenally, and loads of young people came to know Jesus and came out of kind of violence and gang life and all of that. It was a wonderful time in our lives. However, we were also trying to fix the collapsing Victorian building of the church. And in so doing, we're needing to deal with the National Church ancient buildings bureaucracy. Yes, a few years earlier, the building had been condemned as unsafe. And actually, the congregation had been reduced to basically 12 people, 12 praying grannies. And lots of them had come from the Caribbean to the UK in the 1950s. And they'd had an unbroken chain of prayer meetings every Thursday night from 1952, I think, right through to the present day. And they'd been told the building is condemned, the diocese were going to sell it, and they put do not enter tape around the building. And the ladies broke in every Thursday night and said, there is no archdeacon on earth who can tell us we can't pray in our own building. These women had prayed that church back to life. The church was now living and breathing the resurrection power of Jesus at work, seeing people converted from all sorts of trauma and violence and drugs and gangs. So that's the context. The building is condemned, it's unsafe. And there was a sort of particular inspection that happened, and there was a broken organ that hadn't been played for over 45 years. And with the rest of the church, it had been destined for the bulldozer. But now the church had been saved, the bureaucracy was blocking the organ being removed. Now, there was a particular problem with this organ. Not only did it not work, not only was it unfixable, but it also had live unearthed electricity next to a barrel of oil inside a structure with bone-dry wooden pipes. The health and safety inspector noted to my husband, the vicar, that if one switch on the wall was flicked, the entire church would likely explode in a ball of fire. Now, bearing in mind we had all of these young people, some of whom regularly lapped the church on their bikes during the service, we felt it was quite dangerous to just leave that switch there for one of them one day to just go like that, boom. So the PCC, the Church Council, voted that due to the health and safety considerations, we needed to remove the unfixable organ, even though we didn't have the piece of paper from the church bureaucracy. We tried to get the piece of paper, they'd stalled for 3 years, but the fear that someone might flick that switch became too much. A few weeks later, my husband received a letter reprimanding him with the following words: "This church has a record of disregarding ecclesiastical regulations that is positively woeful." This was referring to these women who'd prayed the church back into life, and now to this removal of the organ. Now, my husband actually was quite discouraged by this letter. It's sort of funny when you look back on it, but when you're in the midst of it, it was really discouraging. And so he went to visit a lovely, wonderful clergyman called Jeremy Crossley, a friend and mentor for years. He said, "I'm feeling really discouraged. I just received this letter." Jeremy Crossley took one look at the letter and he said, "My dear boy, well done. He said, it takes most of us 20 years to receive a letter like that. Keep going." Often, so some of the trials we face are going to be trivial, some are going to be substantial, but often threat and the accompanying fear are enough to paralyze us. And this book of Esther ripples with threat.
Haman is threatening Mordecai, I'm going to kill you. And now I'm not just going to kill you, I'm going to take all the stuff of your people and I'm going to kill all of them. And not just a few of them here in the citadel, all of them in the whole known world. Do you feel and hear the threat of the enemy? I'm going to take you out. Resisting fear and threat is a part of the Christian life. So what can we learn from Esther about how we might resist fear? What does Esther teach us about this? Now, before we get into it, I just want to note that a medical anxiety disorder, that is a mental health diagnosis, can be experienced as an illness in the same way that cancer or a broken leg are an illness. And we know that God sometimes intervenes and heals people, but certainly not all the time. And we also know that when God heals, it is not a badge of his approval saying, well done, you were a good Christian, you get a healing. No, we know that healings are signs of God's reality in our world today, pointing us to Jesus, pointing us to a heavenly reality. And so many Christians will struggle with illness, with cancer, with depression, with asthma as a part of following Jesus. It's part of the life. So if you are struggling with anxiety and an anxiety disorder today, hear me today when I say we would love to pray for you in the same way we might pray for any other physical healing. The Lord is the Lord of miracles after all. We'd love to pray for that. But alongside that, the Bible is full of promises that followers of Jesus can and do experience deliverance from natural fears. From fears related to an enemy tactic of confusion, intimidation, and fear. And that as a child of God, in the work God has called you to do, you may well face intimidation. You may well experience fear. And God is powerful enough to intervene and help us. And in his word, he's given us some tools as to how we might resist that enemy.
How do we resist an enemy? Well, we thought together about that idea of fasting and weeping, the impetus to defend ourselves or rear up in some way when we have an enemy is real. But here the biblical pattern is fasting, weeping, sackcloth. It's interesting to me that sackcloth, that was what you put on. You wore it instead of your clothes. And that means that process isn't hidden or private. We can think of fasting or even crying as something we do in private. But tear-stained faces in the Old Testament went together with wearing sackcloth. So it's not private. Now, my preference personally is to keep distress or vulnerability private. This is an area God has worked on in my life, partly through crisis. This is what we see in Esther. You do it in public. You weep and put on sackcloth and fast in public. Secondly, it was all the Jews. It wasn't just Mordecai, the kind of one godly person, but all of God's people together wept and fasted. In other words, you don't resist evil and fear alone. We stand together as a community. We stand for each other. I find that so powerful and also really challenging. It's so hard to ask for help when we need it. And then thirdly, when we resist an enemy, we need to fast and pray and weep, and we need to encourage each other. The encouragement came to Esther to actually stand. In chapter 4, verse 14, if you remain silent at a time like this, relief and deliverance will arise from another place. But you and your father's family will perish. And who knows but that you have come to such a royal position as this for such a time as this. That encouragement to stand. Perhaps some of us need to hear that today, that it's on us to stand up and resist fear and evil. So thank you so much for joining us on the podcast today. Advocate Collective exists to publicly advocate for the Christian faith. And we're also hoping to build an arm of this ministry that serves people who have survived abuse and need resource, theological and psychological, to thrive again in life and faith. We want to come alongside people who don't want to deconstruct faith, but who feel tempted to do that because when abuse happens in religious contexts, it feels like a really obvious thing to do. So if you would like to support that kind of work, you can find us at advocate-collective.org. Thank you so much for listening today, and I hope this message has been a blessing to you.